He arrived without pedigree, without a public resume that could explain the doors that opened for him. And yet Jeffrey Epstein moved through the highest circles of power as if he had always belonged there. Presidents, princes, financiers, scientists, celebrities, and moral leaders crossed his path, often in private spaces, often beyond scrutiny, often shielded by money and influence. He built an image of brilliance and philanthropy while operating in the shadows, cultivating access rather than accountability, proximity rather than transparency. When his crimes finally surfaced in full view, the question was no longer whether abuse had occurred, but how such a system could exist at all, how so many institutions failed so completely, and how a single man could function as a hub where power, secrecy, and exploitation converged. His arrest promised answers. His death, officially ruled a suicide inside a federal jail, extinguished the possibility of testimony and transformed the case into something darker and more enduring, a symbol of justice deferred and trust broken. Now, years later, the release of the so-called Epstein Files has reopened what never truly closed. Court-unsealed documents, depositions, and records have brought names, relationships, and timelines back into the public conscience, not as verdicts, but as questions demanding moral clarity. These files do not deliver neat conclusions. They expose a web of proximity to wrongdoing and the persistent reluctance of power to examine itself. They remind us that systems designed to protect the vulnerable can be hollowed out by wealth and prestige, and that silence, when purchased or coerced, becomes a form of complicity. For a civilization that claims moral foundations, this story is not merely about one criminal. It is about the conditions that allowed him to thrive and the cost of looking away. To understand how this happened, we must go back to the beginning, to the obscure origins of a man whose past was never fully illuminated, and trace the path that led from anonymity to impunity, from influence to infamy. To understand how this happened, we have to return to the beginning, to a man whose origins were unremarkable and whose ascent defied conventional explanation. Jeffrey Epstein was born into a modest family in Brooklyn, showed early aptitude in mathematics, and briefly taught at an elite private school despite lacking a college degree. Even at this early stage, patterns emerged that would later define his life. Proximity to privilege, a talent for ingratiation, and an ability to position himself as indispensable to powerful people. When his teaching career ended abruptly, he reappeared on Wall Street, entering the world of high finance not through a clear track record, but through patronage. At Bear Stearns, he was protected and promoted despite limited credentials, learning not just the mechanics of money, but the psychology of influence. When he left the firm, he did not fade into obscurity. Instead, he surfaced as the head of a mysterious financial operation, later associated with Towers Financial. Managing fortunes for clients whose identities were rarely disclosed, his wealth grew, but more importantly, so did his aura. Epstein cultivated the image of a financial savant whose exclusivity was itself a signal of value. People did not ask how he made his money. They assumed that anyone this well-connected must be legitimate. As his resources expanded, Epstein began constructing something more durable than a portfolio. He built a network, a carefully curated web of relationships that spanned continents and institutions. He donated to universities, funded research initiatives, and positioned himself as a benefactor of science, particularly in cutting-edge fields like artificial intelligence and evolutionary biology. Distinguished academics accepted his money, attended his salons, and lent him credibility, often without scrutiny. At the same time, he embedded himself among politicians and global elites, attending private dinners, flying on private aircraft, and gaining access to palaces and boardrooms alike. British royalty, former heads of state, and influential policymakers were drawn into his orbit, not necessarily through ideology, but through access. Epstein offered introductions, funding, and the promise of belonging to an inner circle that operated beyond public view. This web was not built overnight. It was layered patiently, each connection reinforcing the next, creating an environment where questioning him felt impolite, even dangerous. In such spaces, power does not need to threaten. It simply surrounds. Behind this cultivated image, however, was a reality that would later emerge as systematic abuse. Epstein owned multiple properties, but two would become central to the allegations against him: a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands known as Little St. James, and a sprawling estate in New Mexico referred to as the Zorro Ranch. These were not merely residences. They were controlled environments, isolated from oversight, designed to operate according to his rules. Survivors later described a pattern that was chillingly consistent. Young girls, often from vulnerable backgrounds, were brought into his sphere under the guise of opportunity. Once inside, boundaries were erased and exploitation normalized. Flights, gifts, and money created dependency, while secrecy was enforced through intimidation and manipulation. The island, in particular, became emblematic of this darkness, a place where the absence of witnesses mirrored the absence of accountability. These locations were not accidents of wealth. They were instruments of control, chosen precisely because they insulated Epstein from consequence. Central to this machinery was Ghislaine Maxwell. Her role extended far beyond that of an associate. As the daughter of a powerful media magnate, she moved comfortably among elites and served as a bridge between Epstein and respectable society. According to testimony, she was instrumental in recruiting and grooming victims, presenting exploitation as opportunity and coercion as consent. She managed schedules, enforced loyalty, and helped maintain the illusion that nothing illegal was occurring. Her presence reassured outsiders and trapped insiders, reinforcing the sense that this world, however strange, was sanctioned by power. The dynamic between Epstein and Maxwell illustrates how abuse on this scale rarely operates alone. It requires facilitators who normalize wrongdoing and silence resistance. The first major test of accountability came in the mid-2000s, when local law enforcement in Florida began investigating Epstein. What followed would become one of the most notorious failures of justice in modern American history. Despite evidence pointing to widespread abuse, Epstein was offered a plea deal in 2008 that shielded him from federal prosecution. He pleaded guilty to lesser state charges, served a short sentence with extraordinary privileges, and was allowed extensive freedom. The agreement included provisions that immunized unnamed co-conspirators without informing the victims. This was not merely leniency, it was systemic collapse. Epstein returned to his life of wealth and travel. For years after, his activities continued largely unchecked. Journalists and survivors attempted to keep the story alive. In 2019, federal prosecutors arrested Epstein on charges of sex trafficking of minors. He was held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Within weeks, he was found dead in his cell. The official ruling was suicide, but the circumstances raised immediate questions. Malfunctioning cameras, guards who failed to check. Epstein's death did not bring closure. It intensified distrust. He would never testify. What remained were documents, survivors' voices, and a justice system forced to confront its failures. The unsealing of the Epstein Files revealed fragments of a system laid bare. Depositions, flight logs, and records showed patterns of access long denied. This was not an isolated predator. It was an environment where status overrides scrutiny and accountability dissolves. For the public, this realization cuts deep. It strikes at the foundation of trust. Trust in institutions, trust in leaders, trust in justice itself. When abuse persists for decades, cynicism becomes survival. The Epstein case forces society to ask what else remains unseen. For a civilization shaped by Christian moral claims, this reckoning carries weight. The failure was not only legal, but ethical. The choice to look away, to protect reputation over righteousness. And yet, the story does not end in despair. Silence is not permanent. Truth resurfaces. The Epstein Files do not close the case. They open a chapter of responsibility. They ask future generations what they will tolerate, what they will excuse, and what they will confront. The files are open, and history is now the judge.